Lord God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Okay, well, good morning. And good morning. My name is Monica Schmucker. Most of you know me a little bit. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we deal with conflict. So just to kind of give you a little overview about why I was asked to talk about this, is that a couple of months ago, several of us went to a training in Lincoln. I'm going to move this one second. Several of us went to a training in Lincoln that was sponsored by the Nebraska American Baptist Churches, and it was called Preferred Path, and it uses biblical principles to guide us in how we can handle conflict. And the goal for ABC Nebraska is that they really want to share this. They feel it's really helpful information, and they want to share this with all the congregations and hopefully train some facilitators in each congregation. So Larry asked that those of us who attended, would we be willing to share a little bit about what we learned? So that's why I'm standing up here. And so I'm going to give you a little overview about this program, about the things that we learned. And then in some of the Sundays after Easter, there will be some other people speaking and sharing a little bit about their experience in some different parts of this process. So what I want to just let you know right off the bat is I have a good 3 points. So the 3 points really are, just in case you tune out later on, that one, conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen. Second is that conflict is an opportunity. It can have good or bad outcomes. And third, that in following Jesus means that we handle conflict differently. So when I was thinking a little bit about this, Mark was like, you need to tell another story. Think about something else you can tell that shares a little about you. So I said, okay. Well, many of you know I grew up in Ohio. My dad is from there. That's where my family on that side is at. But my mom is from Germany. So that's why my name is Monica with a long O instead of Monica. And growing up, when my sister and I were little, we'd be, like kids usually are, we were very active. Sometimes we would get into some trouble. And if our mom was upset with us, first she would say, cut it out, stop doing that. And if that didn't work, eventually she started yelling at us in German. And that's when you knew, okay, all right, really, that's it. That mom has reached, that's her last straw, better cut it out right now. And we learned pretty quickly, you better do that. So my mom would yell at us in German, and the thing she would yell was this phrase, she'd say, Doria. And the phrase doesn't really, the words are kind of nonsense actually in German, but we knew exactly what she meant. Cut it out right now. Well, my American grandma on my dad's side lived next door to us, my grandma Schmucker, and so she would babysit us a lot of times. And she would run into the same problem. We would be just getting a little too wild, out of hand, so she would try her various methods of resolving this conflict. And she was prone to her own way of handling that, and she had her own expressions. And she would throw up her hands and she would say, quit running around like a bull in a china shop. Or sometimes one of her other favorites that I can still remember, she would say, stop those monkey shines. Well, it didn't work all that well, but she had been a keen observer of how well this German phrase worked. And so one day she decided, all right, that's what I'm going to have to do. She figured she'd heard it often enough she could do it. And so she yelled, Dunder and Schmerschmermia, or something to that effect. And we had the exact same reaction that you did. We knew what she was trying to say, but it was completely ridiculous. And we stopped what we were doing, but it was mainly because we were laughing so hard. But thankfully, Grandma had a good sense of humor, too. And I just remember it all ended with the three of us just laughing and laughing and laughing about how this went. So, conflict doesn't always get resolved with laughing, but if it does, that's a good thing. So, we've talked a lot of times in this church about the 2 great commandments that Jesus gives us. And it's simple enough. We probably all can remember. Love God, love your neighbor. And I really like this. If Jesus says this is key. If Jesus says this is important, okay, it must be pretty important. And really, it's pretty simple to understand. Honor God and treat other people the way that you want to be treated. Sounds good. Well, the problem is, oops, sorry, my little things are going still. But it's not so easy, is it? Things happen that make it hard to love each other. This was a quote from our training. Whether in the form of a minor disagreement between two people or all-out war between nations, conflict is inevitably present in the world. And I think we know that to be true. I once heard someone say that really every problem in the world is a problem of relationship. And, when you think about it, a lot of problems, either they are directly because of a broken relationship or they're made worse because there's some aspect of things that isn't right in the way that people are relating to each other. And this is true in all kinds of settings, in the world in general, between countries, or also in churches and in our families and with how we relate with each other. It's one of the things that was sad for me to realize was that the major reason that missionaries leave the mission field, and I suspect this is also the major reason that anyone leaves ministry, is because of conflict with other Christians. It's that damaging sometimes that results in those types of things. So, I really liked this little book. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's Children's Letters to God. And sometimes kids really just know how to say it best. So a lot of them are really funny, and so I had to throw a few of them in here. So the top one says, "Dear God, thank you for the baby brother. But what I prayed for was a puppy." And this one says, "Dear Jesus, please don't come back before the next Cars movie." I remember having fears like that once in a while. So there was another one in here I didn't put up that seemed appropriate. It said, "Dear God, I keep waiting for spring, but it doesn't seem to come. Please don't forget." This one, though, has always stuck with me. This little girl says, "Dear God, I bet it is very hard for you to love all of everybody in the whole world. There are only 4 people in my family, and I can never do it." So honest. And I realize what I like about this letter is, too, she really thinks about how it must be hard for God sometimes as well. But I think we've all had kind of that experience, that it is difficult. Well, why do we have conflicts? Well, there's a lot of different reasons that we have conflicts. And what we come to understand is that most conflicts involve multiple reasons. There's usually more than one thing. But here's just a list of a couple of things that are common reasons why we have conflicts. Different interests, different personalities, communication breakdowns, negative treatment, psychological issues, and sometimes it's just evil. Evil in the world can cause a lot of problems. One thing that wasn't listed here that I thought was really significant sometimes is, among these differences, is you also sometimes have cultural differences. So I lived in North Carolina for 9 years, and I worked at the Children's Hospital there, and I worked with some very Southern nurses. And with that, they were wonderful ladies. They were very hospitable. They always wanted you to feel welcome. They would talk to anybody, treat you like family, and they're also very polite. If you're going to say something negative about someone, you always have to throw in the phrase, "bless her heart." For example, "She can't carry a tune in a bucket, bless her heart," or something to that effect. So I worked with these nurses, and we had a doctor who also worked there on the unit who was from Germany. And one day we were sitting around talking, and I realized that these nurses think this German doctor is not very nice. And she was just very matter-of-fact about things. She didn't make a lot of small talk. And that was just kind of her way. And to them, that was just really kind of cold and not very nice. And I and another lady who had a German roommate, we immediately blurted out, we said, "Oh, she's not being mean, she's being German." And I will tell you from experience, yeah, Germans do not understand small talk. It does not make sense to them why you would be talking when you didn't need to with someone you don't really know. And sometimes they're very private, so sometimes, if you're like, "Oh, hey, how are your kids?" and this, that, and the other, they're a little unsure about that. Why are they asking me such personal questions? So cultural differences sometimes can be a big factor if we don't understand the different approaches that we have. Conflicts are an opportunity. And this really jumped out at me when I went through my notes again. So often we characterize conflict as a negative, as a bad thing. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. It really is an opportunity. Now, there definitely are some bad outcomes from conflicts. And we've probably all experienced these. Broken relationships, low morale, particularly like in a workplace. Sometimes physical or psychological harm can result. And particularly for like companies or churches or things like that, you can have financial loss, especially when things don't get resolved and people are going to court and those types of things. But I hadn't thought about the fact that actually you can have some very good outcomes with conflict. And among those are, you can actually have improved relationships. You work through a conflict, and afterwards, you realize, you've built a better understanding between people, better teamwork. Sometimes it builds confidence, too, that if you've weathered this conflict, you've figured out how to work through it and still stay friends, that you can feel more confident in the future when there's an issue that you disagree about. And additionally, sometimes there's a conflict because things aren't working very well. You can come to a good conclusion and actually make positive changes where they need to happen. So the way I think about conflict now is that I imagine it a little bit like driving when there's bad weather. So usually it's nice and clear like today, you can see really far. But occasionally I drive in the morning to work and it's really foggy. So key things, you gotta slow down, you turn on your lights, and you look and pay attention for signs to kind of keep you on the road. So the lights ahead of you, reflectors, the lines on the road, that kind of thing. So conflict is kind of like that too. It's a little unclear what's all going on, how to proceed, so you have to move with care. So as Christians, we kind of think about how we're going to handle conflict. And one story that came to mind to me was this. One morning, a mom is making breakfast for her kids. She's making them their favorite breakfast, pancakes. It's for 2 boys. And as siblings are apt to do, they start arguing. Who's going to get the first pancake? And they're bickering back and forth about this. Well, the mom says, teachable opportunity. So she says to them, "Now, boys, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus say?" Well, they kind of just look at each other, they don't say anything. So she finally prompts them. She says, "Well, Jesus would say, 'Let my brother have the first pancake.'" Turns back to cooking her pancakes, and there's some silence for a little bit, and then she hears one of them say, "You be Jesus." And I think in a lot of conflicts, that's how I feel. I'd really like that other person to act like Jesus. That's why there's a problem, right? They need to act like Jesus. So that, I think, is our natural inclination. But let's look a little bit at some guidance that Jesus does give us in Scripture. So I can start reading this a little bit. This is out of Matthew 5, and we covered this some time ago. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount. So I'll read the beginning piece of it, and then when we get to this, we can read it together. "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." So join me in this part, this kind of key piece. "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly. With your adversary, he goes on to say, who's taking you to court. Do it while you're still on the way. Well, the things that stand out to me in this passage, what Jesus is trying to tell us is, first off, that God does care how we relate to each other. It really does matter. And secondly, I really feel like there's a certain urgency that's expressed there. You may be ready to offer your gift to God. If you remember then that there's something you need to do, leave your gift, go right away, deal with that, talk to that brother or sister, and then try to be reconciled, and then make your offering. Settle matters quickly. Don't let it fester. Don't let it wait, and resentments and conflicts just build. Try to address it sooner rather than later. The next passage here is also out of Matthew. This is out of Matthew 18, and I can just read it for you. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector. So there's a lot you could say about this, and here are just a few things that stand out to me. That this is kind of a stepwise approach. Talk to the person, try to resolve the conflict, and bring in other people to help you resolve it as needed. And honestly, even at the last part, even if it's a kind of situation you can't resolve it, remember that Jesus reminds us to pray for our enemies, to love our enemies, pray for those who persecute us. And it sounds pretty harsh, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector, until you remember how Jesus treated tax collectors, how he always was loving toward people regardless. So the steps that we talked about in our training really are focused a lot around these 2 scriptures as guidance. Now, going to someone that you're having a conflict with, probably from our own experiences, we realize there are good ways to do that may help you resolve it, and there's definitely ways you can go about this that don't really resolve anything and may make things worse. So I am hopeful that I think in some of the future weeks we're going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we learned about how to be a good listener, how to talk with each other in a way that you can build consensus and build understanding, even when you have differences. I thought about 2 examples in the church about one that's kind of a not so good way of doing this and one that I think is a better way. So the first one happened to my friend Leah. When we were in high school, we helped out ushering at our church, and we liked doing that. And one day Leah tells me that someone left an anonymous note in her family's mailbox at church. And the note said that she wasn't dressed appropriately to be an usher. Her skirt was too short. Well, Leah was the kind of person who would kind of take this to heart. She felt bad that someone was offended, but honestly, she and we could not even figure out what it was that someone was offended about. She said, I really don't know which skirt they found to be inappropriate. Thankfully, Leah didn't let that thing keep her from continuing to serve as an usher, but it definitely made her feel uncomfortable, and it made her feel kind of self-conscious. She always said she had to think twice about what she was going to wear on a particular Sunday if she was going to be ushering. So, anonymous note, maybe it made this other person feel better that they had expressed that they were unhappy or concerned about this, but it really didn't give an opportunity to resolve things because really didn't know exactly what the problem was. Second story comes from my friend Alex at my church in North Carolina. And he told us once that in his church growing up, they really made a big emphasis on this being reconciled thing the Sunday before they were going to have communion. And it was really, you were supposed to think about if there's something that you need to ask forgiveness about, if there's something you're having a conflict with someone about, try to resolve it before the next Sunday, before we have communion. Well, one Sunday after church, an older man from his church, a farmer, came up to him and said, "Alex, we need to talk." And the man went on and he said, Someone's been out driving their pickup truck through my field and tearing it up. He said, and I know it was you. The man went on to say, but I want to have communion with you next Sunday, so I want you to know that I forgive you. And this made a really big impression on Alex because, yeah, the guy was right. He had done it. He and his friends were out joyriding, having a good time, having a good fun with their pickup truck, and yes, it had made a mess, tore up this field. He didn't know that this guy had figured out who did it, and he hadn't gone to this man and apologized. But here was this man who he'd wronged, who came to him to say, we need to resolve this, and I want to be reconciled with you. And what really stood out, and the reason I think Alex remembered this story so many years later, is because he realized this guy didn't just see him as a thoughtless, reckless teenager who doesn't respect people's property. He still saw him as a brother in Christ and really wanted them to have a good relationship. So this is kind of a little outline of the steps that we talked about in our training. And I'm just going to kind of focus on the first part. So we have pray and prepare is one step. Act in love is a second step. Listen and speak collaboratively is a third step. Fourth step, request mediation. Involve other people as you need to help you resolve things. Fifth, hire authority. Sometimes you have to get other people to weigh in on the situation to help us make a decision. And the sixth step is other actions that sometimes are necessary. There's a website listed there, preferredpathministry.com. And that if this is interesting to you, you can look up that website and you can actually log in. They have stuff set up. If you use ABCNE for the login and the password, you can see they've got a whole bunch of little tools and things, how to start those kind of conversations, just some helpful stuff there. So this is a little bit about it. We want to get to potluck, so I'm definitely not going through all of these steps. I'm just going to focus on the first two. And the first one is, of course, pray and prepare. This stood out to me because I think when I'm upset about something, when I'm in a conflict with someone, this is not my first instinct to do this. I think it's really easy. I feel defensive. I want to prove how they're wrong, that kind of thing. But I think the advice here is pause before you react. Anybody ever have that experience where you kind of wish you had waited a little bit or at least thought something through before you? Yeah. I'll tell you where I usually find that is the worst for me is email. You get some email from somebody at work or something and you're just irritated and frustrated and fire off an email back. Oh, I have sent a couple of emails I really wish I hadn't sent. And the thing I've learned out of that is do not try to resolve a conflict through email. It will not be resolved. It will just continue to snowball and more people get pulled into it. So first, pray. And the verse that came to mind in me is out of Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Some of the conflicts we deal with are kind of minor things that probably won't turn into a big problem. Others are really major things. And regardless of the type of conflict it is or what's going on, we need some guidance. We need some help. And the good thing is, as Christians, we have that. We can pray. We can ask God to guide us on that. Sometimes, too, you'll find out you think you understand what the situation is, but you really don't. And so taking that time to be thoughtful, be prayerful, ask God to guide you about how should I go about this? What do I need to find out and understand before reacting? The second thing is act in love. Now, when I'm in conflict with people, acting in love is not a natural instinct. I mean, I really like a little revenge sometimes. It's really satisfying in some disturbing ways. But this is not the way we should handle things. Acting in love really is. And I think the key question is, what can I do to improve this situation? Instead of focusing on what the other person did wrong, what can I do to make this situation better? And I think love is a difficult word sometimes to sort out, but I think the guidance here would be thinking about 1 Corinthians 13, what love is. Love is patient, love is kind, doesn't envy, doesn't boast. It's not rude, it's not self-seeking. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. And those are really key things. I think a lot of conflicts would be much more easily resolved in my life if I kept in mind just even these two things. But as you can see, that is pretty hard. And I love this little card. I found this somewhere and I just loved it. This little girl here sitting thinking, and the caption is, "It's exhausting being a lover instead of a fighter, especially when you know that one good smack would settle it." I have definitely felt that way. Trying to work through something when you're sure you're right and you're sure that there's something you could do that would just settle this and you wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. So, yes, this path that we talked about, some of these steps, really goes against that impulse to just one good smack and settle it. And it's also very different from what we see around us so much of the time. I mean, a lot of reality TV shows would be completely boring if people weren't reacting badly to conflict, right? And I'm pretty sure that a lot of our political discourse and discussions would be a lot different if we weren't reacting in the way that we are, the way we've seen it portrayed. You've got to be tough, you've got to hit back, that kind of thing. But it's important to keep in mind that while this way, some of the things that Jesus outlines for us about handling conflict is not easy, the alternatives, really, we got to think through what are our options instead. And they're not real great. A big option that I think especially in families and in churches happens is avoidance. There's this conflict, there's this problem, I don't want people to get upset, I'm just going to ignore the problem, I'll avoid it. How well does that usually work? I see people shaking their head no. It doesn't work real well. There's some things you can just decide to overlook and that's fine. But what tends to happen is it still bothers you and it sort of builds up and it sort of builds up. And then either there's some kind of big blow up or people just walk away and say, I don't want to deal with that. I'll just avoid, I'll just leave and I'll stop being in relationship with that person. The other things that sometimes happen is litigation. We are a society that likes to take things to court. And again, it depends on the type of situation, but oftentimes that really, it's hard to get a good resolution that way. It's a great way for lawyers to make money, but even if you get a judgment in your favor, it doesn't always mean you get things really resolved. It takes a lot of time and money too. And the third thing is force, using violence against people. Obviously, we know how deadly that is and how dangerous and the kind of long-term hurts that can cause, as well as just kind of power plays where one person says, you know what, I have the power here, I'm just going to give the metaphorical one good smack. I'm going to make the decision here and I'm going to settle this. Doesn't really make for very good relationships. So I think as we go through this, it's important to kind of keep the goal in mind. Sometimes it's hard, trying to be a good listener, trying to pray about things, trying to act in love when you don't feel like it. But keep in mind the goals here, is that if we can work through a conflict in a more positive and collaborative way, ultimately what we all really want as a resolution to the problem are one of these four things, or maybe all four. We want to make sure that things are restored to the way they should be. Justice, peace, unity, and healing. And these are good goals. These are goals that really, I think, embody the things that Jesus is teaching and are examples in our own lives of what Christ has done for us with his death on the cross, his resurrection. He's restored that relationship for us with God. Now he's giving us the empowerment and the tools and the ability to spread that in the way that we relate to each other. So this verse is a pretty good one out of Romans. There's a lot of really practical advice in a lot of these letters, and one of the things that jumped out at me as well in a lot of the New Testament letters is that Paul and some of the other writers, they're often addressing some kind of conflict that's going on in this church. So this happens a lot, and there's sometimes some really practical steps about getting along. I like this verse. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So just to sum up, the three things that really stood out to me from the training was that accepting that conflict happens. It is a normal part of the way that we live together. But that conflict, the second thing is that conflict is an opportunity. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. We can have good outcomes with conflict. And the third thing is that Jesus gives us good guidance in how we can resolve conflicts. So I will ask the musicians to come up, and I want to thank you for listening, and I hope that there's something you were able to take from this, and appreciated that I had the chance to go to this training. Be prayerful about how to apply these things, because I can only speak in generalities up here. How to handle any particular situation is really going to depend on a lot of factors. But I hope that you can feel a little bit more confident that there are good ways to handle things, and that you do have the ability to do that we all have that ability.